A rancher who had stopped eating 2 winters back lifted a lid and went perfectly still. The bowl had been left on his porch by a small, quiet woman who stepped off the supply wagon in a kimono the color of wet slate, holding a cedar keg against her ribs like something alive. The town of Bitter Springs already blamed her for the dying cattle and called her the Chinawoman, and this rancher was the only man between her and a rope. What lived inside that keg was older than any of them, and 1 hard freeze from dead. Stay until the end to see what was really inside, and why the man who trusted no one sat down to a bowl he did not ask for. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The supply wagon rolled into Bitter Springs on the last day of a thin spring. The mules were blowing hard, and the driver was cursing the creek crossing where the water had gone down to a brown string. The town sat in a fold of Montana territory in the year 1883, and it had been dying slow for longer than anyone cared to count. The creek that named it was going thin. The general store kept its shelves half bare out of habit now, and the saloon had more empty chairs than full ones on a Saturday night. 3 of the bartee's best hands had already drifted south for better wages, and the men still left in the bunkhouse spent their evenings looking at the door. The wagon unloaded the usual things: crates of salt, sacks of coffee, a bolt of cloth that nobody in Bitter Springs had the money to buy. Then it unloaded 1 woman. She was small-framed and thin in a way that spoke of hunger rather than delicacy. Her jet black hair was pulled back tight and pinned in a traditional Japanese knot. Almond-shaped, dark eyes set above high cheekbones and a face the color of pale river clay. She wore a kimono the color of wet slate beneath a trail coat stiff with road grime, and she had wrapped her geta in cloth so they would not sink into the muck of the street. She never wore Western clothes. She carried 1 object in the world, a cedar keg, lacquered dark and lashed with cord, and she held it against her ribs the way a woman holds a sleeping child. Nobody asked her name. They only stared. Somebody on the saloon porch said she was a Chinawoman, and another man corrected him with a guess that she was some kind of Oriental, and the general store owner, Cyrus Dodd, leaned in his doorframe and offered that she was a heathen either way. She answered them in silences, and the silences had a weight to them that made the staring men look away first, which made the stranger's arrival all the more unsettling, because a woman who would not explain herself in a town like this was a problem with no handle on it. She had come because of a vow, not because of any man. Her grandmother's village outside Kyoto had been starving, and the only thing worth saving from it was the keg. A contact in San Francisco had sent her east to a town whose name she could not yet pronounce. She had crossed an ocean carrying a living thing, and she intended to keep it alive, and the rest of the territory could make of her what it chose. Hank Travers watched the whole unload from the buckboard across the street, his foreman beside him and his hat pulled low. He was the rancher every man in Bitter Springs feared, a name built on a hard hand and a short temper, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. He had buried his wife Mary 2 winters back, and he had not tasted a meal that mattered since. He meant to ride past the woman and the whole business of her. Then his horse spooked at the keg, and she looked up and met his eyes, and she did not look away the way people looked away from Hank Travers. Something small and inconvenient shifted in him. He gave her shelter in the empty cookshack at the Bartee, not from kindness, but because Mary would have ridden past, and he knew it, and the knowing sat in him like a splinter. The Bartee Ranch sat in a shallow valley 3 miles north of town, and it was running on coffee and spite. Hank Travers ate jerky and hardtack standing up at the kitchen counter, and he had been doing it so long that he had forgotten there was another way to eat. 2 winters of grief had worn him into a man who moved through his own house like a guest who could not leave. His cracked hands still worked the tack and the fence wire, but the work had gone mechanical, and the men doing it beside him were fewer every month. The food of the place told the whole story. Salt pork soaked too short and still burning the tongue. Beans cooked down to a paste that tasted like nothing and stuck to the ribs like mortar. Coffee boiled until it drank like tar, and hardtack you soaked in water or you broke a tooth on it. The chuck wagon cook, old Walt, had died the prior fall off a kicked rib, and the job had gone into the dirt with him. Walt had been the camp doctor, and the vet, and the nurse, and the man who wrote letters home for the hands who could not write, because that was what a chuck wagon cook was on a frontier ranch. With Walt gone, the Bar-T had nobody to doctor a horse, let alone a man, and the men knew it. Amy slept in Walt's old cookshack the first night, and she stood a long time looking at the crock on the high shelf. It was the sourdough crock Walt had tended every dawn for 15 years, now untouched and dead. She looked at it the way a woman looks at the grave of a stranger who did her same work. Then she set her cedar keg on the shelf beside it, and the two containers sat there together, one dead and one breathing, and the lamplight flickered amber on the wall between them. The first morning she asked to cook. She found Hank at the porch rail and said it low, in English that came out careful and broken, her eyes down and then up, the 4 words the title of this story would carry. "Let me cook for you." He refused her flat, without looking at her, and told her she could stay the week and then the wagon would take her back. She cooked anyway. She made a small pot of something from almost nothing, and she set it on the bunkhouse stove for the hands and walked out before they could thank her or refuse her. The hands ate it because they were hungry and because it smelled like nothing they had a name for, and they said nothing about it where Hank could hear. The town's prejudice sharpened inside a week. Cyrus Dodd worked the saloon bar the way he worked everything, with a soft voice and a sharp intent, and he said out loud what the frightened men were already thinking. The foreign woman was putting things in the food. The cattle had started sickening the week she arrived. The keg she carried was a heathen charm. The men who could not tell one Asian face from another, and did not care to, made her the cause of what they could not explain. A steer dropped dead in the north pasture on a Wednesday, and by Thursday the bunkhouse was muttering that it had started the day she came. Amy ate her own bowl those first days, and she ate it small, sitting on the cookshack step with the keg beside her, like someone who had learned long ago that food could be taken away. The detail was the kind of thing a watching man would notice, and the kind of thing that did all the emotional work without a word of explanation. Hank noticed it. He did not yet know what to do with the noticing. She had been quiet for 3 days, building a kitchen out of nothing, the way a woman builds a house out of scraps when no one will give her timber. The spring nights were still cold enough to freeze the water bucket, and she kept the cedar keg wrapped in a quilt against the cookshack wall, because what lived in it could not take a hard frost any more than a newborn could. She had traded sewing for a block of kombu from a merchant who did not know what it was and called it seaweed, and she had talked a peddler out of a handful of dried shiitake caps in exchange for mending his coat. She had no rice yet for the culture to feed on, and she was rationing the last of what she had carried from the coast, a spoonful a day, the way a woman rations milk for a child through a hard week. She had no bonito, no fish, no dried sardines, and so she made the stock the way a mountain temple makes it, vegetarian and clean. She soaked the kombu and the shiitake in cold water and brought them to a bare simmer and never a hard boil, and she lifted the kombu out before the water could turn bitter. She ground a spoonful of her grandmother's miso from the cedar keg into a small bowl of the hot stock, stirring it smooth before she poured it back into the pot, because the miso was a living thing, and a hard boil would kill what lived in it. She added what the frontier offered, a wild onion pulled from the creek bank, and a sliver of the last carrot from Walt's cold cellar. Then she ladled the soup into a lidded lacquer bowl she had carried wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the keg. She set the bowl on the porch rail of the ranch house and walked away without a word, and the lid held the steam and the smell in. She knocked on nothing. She waited for nothing. She went back down to the creek to wash the pot, and she left the bowl to do its own work. Hank came out planning to ignore it the way he ignored everything that asked something of him. The lid sat there in the morning light, lacquered dark, and he could smell it before he lifted it, something clean and deep that was not the salt and the smoke of the trail, something that was the sea and the earth at once. He lifted the lid. The steam came up into his face. He stood with the spoon she had left beside the bowl, and the rancher who had stopped eating 2 winters back lifted the spoon and drank. He went still. His hand stopped mid-air, the spoon dripping back into the bowl, his jaw working slow, his eyes going somewhere the men in his bunkhouse had never seen him go. It was not shock at the strange, because Hank Travers was not a man who shocked at food. It was the first thing in 2 winters that tasted like a reason to sit down, to stay, to want another morning. The broth was clean and deep and savory in a way the frontier diet had no word for, because the frontier diet ran on salt and smoke and endurance, and this ran on something else entirely, something that woke the back of the tongue and the chest behind it. He drank the bowl down to the dregs, and when he looked up, she was already gone, washing the pot in the creek with her back to him, and the keg sat on the cookshack step beside her like a sentinel. He had not expected that. He had expected a foreign woman and a foreign food and a small, inconvenient charity he would have to refuse. He had not expected a bowl of soup to reach past 2 winters of grief and find the man still alive under it. He stood on the porch, holding the empty bowl for longer than he would have admitted to anyone. Then he did a thing he had not done since the funeral, which was to carry a dish to a sink and wash it himself, because leaving it for her felt wrong in a way he could not have named. Bo, the youngest hand, watched the whole thing from the bunkhouse porch and said nothing, but the steam had crossed the yard to him too, and he could not stop thinking about it for the rest of the day. The bowl sat empty on the rail, and the lid beside it, and the rancher stood there a long time holding a spoon he did not yet know how to put down. That night, for the first time since Mary died, Hank Travers walked down the graded dirt path to the cookshack, and he knocked on the door of a woman he had tried to ride past, and he asked her rough and short what was in the bowl. The kerosene lamp threw a flickering amber light across the cookshack wall, the kind of light the territory ran on, unsteady and warm and nothing like the steady white beam a later age would mistake lamplight for. Hank stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he asked again what was in the bowl, and the question came out harder than he meant because he had forgotten how to ask a thing softly. Ami crossed the small room and lifted the lid of the cedar keg. Inside, dark and fragrant, sat a paste the color of wet earth, and the smell of it rose up into the lamplight and filled the room the way the soup had filled his mouth. She said one word in broken English, the only word she would give it that night. The word was Miso. She pointed to the paste and then to the bowl still sitting on his porch rail, and she let the connection do its own explaining. The narrator does not need to explain what miso is, because the rancher's face is doing it. The slow recognition of a man looking at the source of the thing that reached him. Then she did the thing that made it frontier legible. She pointed to Walt's dead sourdough crock on the high shelf, and then to her keg, and she mimed the work of tending it, feeding it, keeping it warm, checking it every dawn. Hank had watched Walt tend a sourdough starter every morning for 15 years, feeding it flour and water and keeping it warm through the cold, and he understood before she finished the gesture. His face changed. What lived in the keg was alive the way Walt's starter had been alive, a culture you fed and kept and carried, and she had carried this one across an ocean the way Walt had carried his sourdough crock across 3 territories. The cowboy's recognition did all the work, and the narrator stepped back and let it. The stakes of the living thing came out slowly in her broken English and his slow questions. The culture was hungry. It needed rice or grain to feed on, and warmth through the winter, and care every day, and on the frontier it was one hard freeze from dead. She had carried it close to her body and out of the wind because it was the one thing from her grandmother's village worth saving. The keg had been tended in Kyoto for longer than Ami had been alive, and the vow she had made was simple and impossible, to keep it alive and to let it keep others alive. She told him, in pieces, that she had not come for him or for any man. She had come because the village was starving, and the keg was the only answer she had, and the contact in San Francisco had sent her east to a town she had never seen, to people who would call her names she did not bother to correct. Her grandmother had tended the keg through a famine and a war and the year the river froze solid, and the old woman's last instruction had been to take it where people were hungry and let it work. Hank asked her, rough and careful at once, why she had come so far for strangers who would not thank her, and she looked at him the way she had looked at Walt's dead crock, and she said that the keg did not care whether a man thanked it, only whether he ate. He sat with that for a while. Hank sat down on the stool in her doorway, the first time he had sat down willingly in months, and he did not leave for a long time. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who both knew what it cost to keep a living thing alive when everything around you was dying. The lamplight flickered between them, and the keg sat on the shelf breathing its slow breath, and outside the Montana night was already turning cold. What lived inside that keg was older than any of them, and the winter was coming, and the question that neither of them said out loud was whether it would still be alive by spring. The slow decline of Bitter Springs turned into a crisis inside a week. 3 more steers dropped dead in the north pasture, and 2 of the remaining hands came down with a flux that left them green and shaking, and the creek ran thinner than it had in any living man's memory. Cyrus Dodd worked the saloon bar with his soft voice and his sharp intent, and he said out loud what every frightened man in town was already thinking. The foreign woman had brought it. Her foreign food had poisoned the water. The keg was a heathen charm, and she was putting curses in the broth. The men who could not tell one Asian face from another, and would not have cared if they could, made her the cause of every dying thing they could not explain. Then the Bar T's best bull went down in the north pasture on a Friday afternoon, and a delegation rode up to Hank's porch before the sun was off the ridge. Cyrus Dodd at the head of it with 6 men behind him. They were not there to talk. They were there to tell Hank Travers to turn the woman out before the whole town died with her. And the threat under the request was the threat that always comes when frightened men gather in numbers, that they would ride her off the land themselves, or worse. Hank stepped off the porch and put himself between Amy and the horses. He did not raise his voice. He said one line, flat and low, the single protective claim that reorders a room, that she was his by his own word, and any man who touched her would answer to him for it. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, and the men on the horses heard it and went still in their saddles. It was a lie, and Hank knew it, and Amy standing behind him knew it, and the lie bound them into a single target in front of witnesses. Therefore, the town now believed she was his wife, and Hank Travers, who had not touched another human being in 2 winters, had claimed a stranger in front of 6 men who would carry it home to every kitchen in Bitter Springs. Amy's answer was not gratitude. She gave him one look that said she had not asked him to do that, and a slight bow that said she would not undo it, and she turned and walked back into the cookshack and closed the door. The subtext did all the work, and the narrator did not need to explain what the bow cost her. Inside the crisis, the real cause was something no one in the delegation had bothered to look for. Ami had seen livestock fail this way in her grandmother's village, and she walked the north pasture the next morning with Hank beside her and showed him what the frightened men had not stopped to see. A dead elk had washed into the creek bend upstream of the lower pasture, and the water below it ran slow and foul, and a white crust of alkali crusted the seep where the cattle came down to drink. The cattle were not cursed. They were drinking bad water and eating alkali, and the hand's flux was bad water and bad rations, not foreign magic. She let the evidence do the arguing, and the affirmative truth did its own work after the superstition had used up its room. She knelt beside the sickest steer and checked its eyes and its gums and murmured something about heat and damp, the language of Campo, which she left untranslated. The narrator let Hank watch and decide what it meant. She mixed a paste from roots she had dug on the south ridge and a measure of her miso and rubbed it along the steer's gums and the inside of its ears, the way her grandmother had treated a failing ox. And she told Hank in her broken English to move the herd off the lower water before nightfall. He rode to dam the seep and move the herd to the upper pasture that afternoon, and the first steer she treated stood up the next morning on stiff legs and walked to the clean water. The town did not apologize. The town never did. But the dying slowed, and the muttering in the bunkhouse lost its clean target, and the lie Hank had told on the porch started to look less like a mistake and more like the first true thing he had said in 2 years. The cost of standing for her showed up in his own body before the week was out. Hank had taken a splintered fence rail in the side 2 years back, when a stampede had driven the herd through the south wire, and old Walt had patched the wound with whiskey and a needle, the way a chuck wagon cook always patched a wound, because the cook was the doctor and the nurse and the vet out where no doctor would come. It had healed over wrong, a ridge of scar that ached in the cold, and the cold ride to dam the seep opened it. By the second night, the wound was red and hot and smelling wrong, and the territory's nearest doctor was 60 miles off down a creek too thin to float a wagon. Hank went down in the bunkhouse on the third night, the fever climbing, the wound turning septic in the way that a frontier wound turns septic when there is no one left who knows how to stop it. The hands stood around him uselessly, because they could doctor a horse but not a man, and the man who could have done both was dead and buried the prior fall. Bo saddled a horse and rode for the doctor anyway, knowing the whole time that the doctor would not come in time, and that he was riding more for the doing of a thing than for the hope of it. Amy came in without being asked. She carried a second lacquered case, smaller than the keg, and she opened it on the bunkhouse table, and the needles inside were so fine they caught no light at all, tools her grandmother had used in Kyoto before Amy was born. She set to work. She set needles along the line of the wound at the points her grandmother had taught her to find by touch, and she ground a poultice from roots she had gathered on the ridge, and a paste of her miso spread clean over the closed edges of the wound. The fermented culture went on the way her grandmother had always laid it, because a clean fermented thing on a fouled wound was the medicine her line trusted. The script does not claim a study for this. It claims only that the woman believed it, and that the man was dying, and that no one else in Bitter Springs had a better answer. The rancher watched her work from inside the fever, and the watching did something to him that 2 winters of grief had not managed. He saw that a woman he had tried to ride past was the only reason he would see the morning, and that everything he had believed about who held the power on the frontier was wrong. The men with the guns and the hard hands and the short tempers were wrong in the presence of a small woman with needles so fine they caught no light. He had not expected that. The night passed long, the lamplight steady because she kept it steady, her hands steady because she kept them steady. The bunkhouse stayed quiet because the hands had backed to the walls and did not know what to do with a man being saved by a woman they had wanted to run out a week before. The shame of that sat in the room alongside the lamplight, and none of them could look at her directly, and none of them could leave either, and so they stayed against the wall and watched a stranger save the man who paid them. The fever broke at dawn. Not clean and not fast, but it broke, and Hank opened his eyes to the gray light coming in the bunkhouse window, and the first thing he saw was Amy asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still resting on the edge of the dressing, and the cedar keg of her grandmother's miso sitting on his nightstand like it belonged there. She had not done it because he had claimed her in front of the town. She had done it because a living thing was dying, and she knew what that cost. And the vow she had made to her grandmother applied to a hard man the same way it applied to a keg of miso. The morning was quiet and warm and small, and the narrator refused to name what was in the room, because the naming would have made it smaller. When Hank could stand, he pulled on his boots and walked out onto the porch, and the whole town was there waiting for him. They did not have rope this time. They had sick kin and empty bowls, and they stood at his gate in the early light and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And finally the oldest of them asked, low and ashamed, if the foreign woman would cook for them too. Hank gave one nod from the porch, and Ami looked at him across the yard, and she carried the keg down to the cookshack herself. The wives of the men who had called her the Chinawoman stood at the gate with sick children on their hips and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that did not sound like an apology they were not yet ready to make. The keg went down off the porch in her arms, and the living thing inside it was about to leave her hands for the first time since Kyoto. The town-wide transformation began as a spreading of a living culture, the way a sourdough starter spreads from one crock to the next down a valley. Ami taught the ranch wives and the new chuck wagon cook, young Bo, who had been watching her since the steam crossed the yard that first morning, how to tend the keg. She showed them how to feed it a spoonful of cooked grain every dawn, how to keep it warm through the cold, how to never let it freeze, how to read its smell for sickness the way Walt had read his sourdough. She taught them the vegetarian dashi from kombu and shiitake, because there was no bonito in Montana Territory, and there never would be. She taught them to dissolve the miso at the very end, stirring it smooth in a small bowl of the hot stock before it went back to the pot, because the miso was alive, and a hard boil would kill it. The frontier women, who already kept sourdough crocks and vinegar mothers of their own, understood the keg in their hands before they understood it in their heads. The food of Bitter Springs changed inside a season. The salt pork and the rock-hard hardtack gave way, not all at once, but by degrees, to broth that tasted like the sea and the earth at once, to soups that used the dashi as a base under beans and dried apple and the last of the root vegetables. A bowl now sat at the center of a table that men sat down to instead of eating standing up. A ranch wife who had not owned a tablecloth in her marriage set one out for the first time on a Tuesday, because the food asked for it in a way that beans and hardtack never had. The town did not become rich. It did not become a legend. It stopped dying, the way a body stops dying when the blood starts moving again. And the men who had been eyeing the door stayed, and the creek even came back a little by the first snow. But not everyone accepted it, and the refusal came from the man who was losing his grip on the town as the food and the healing spread from a woman he had tried to destroy. Cyrus Dodd rode up to the cookshack one night with 2 men behind him after the lamplight was out and the snow had started, to smash the keg and run Amy out for good. This was the maximum stakes moment of the whole story. the living culture, and the vow, and Amy's place in the town, all riding on one dark porch. And the narrator slows down here, because the slow is where the weight is. Amy did not scream. She lifted a naginata from the wall of the cookshack, a long, curved blade on a lacquered shaft, wrong for this country and unmistakably deadly. The weapon her line had carried in Kyoto when a woman had to defend a threshold without a man to do it for her. She did not raise her voice. She set the blade between the keg and the door and waited. And the geometry of how she held it told the three men everything they needed to know about what would happen if they took one more step. The lamplight she had just lit threw the curved edge across the wall in a thin, bright line. Then Hank was there, barefoot in the snow, his shirt open over the wound that was still healing, and he did not need the naginata. He said one line, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst, and Cyrus Dodd looked at the blade and the barefoot rancher and the quiet woman behind them both, and he rode off into the dark, knowing the town was no longer his. The keg survived, the vow held, but Amy stood in the doorway a long time after they were gone, the naginata still in her hands, and the narrator notes only once that her grip was steady and her breathing was not, because the cost of staying had just shown itself to her, and it was the cost of staying anywhere. The threat was past, and the town was fed, and the rancher who trusted no one picked up his tools and started to build. He did not announce it. He nailed together a real kitchen onto the cookshack over the course of a week, plank by plank, with a proper stove hauled up from the county seat on a buckboard, because a buckboard was the work vehicle of its day and not a carriage, and a stove was a load that asked for a work vehicle. He planed the counter smooth with his own hands, the same hands that had not touched a plane since Mary died. He hung a new shelf at the height Amy would reach without stretching, because he had watched her stand on a crate to get the keg down, and it had bothered him in a way he did not examine too closely. He did not say it was for her. He just built it, and the hands watched and said nothing, because they knew, and because saying it out loud would have made Hank Travers stop. Bitter Springs did not boom. The creek came back a little more by the first thaw. The hands stayed. The general store sold out of kombu to a peddler who did not know what it was and did not care, and the ranch wives came down to the cookshack on Saturdays to feed their own kegs and trade news and ask Ami, in the broken common tongue they were slowly building between them, what to do when a culture soured or went thin. The cedar keg sat on the new kitchen shelf beside a row of new crocks, daughters of the original, started by the ranch wives from a spoonful Ami had given each of them, and the living thing had multiplied the way living things do when they are fed and tended and given away. The keg and its daughters sat together on the shelf the way Walt's crock and Ami's keg had sat together that first night, except now both sides of the shelf were breathing. Walt's dead crock still stood at the end of the row, and nobody moved it, because it belonged there as much as the others did. One evening, she set a bowl of miso soup on the new kitchen table, and he sat across from her and ate it slow, the way a man eats when he means to stay. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. Two people who had both learned what it cost to keep a living thing alive when everything around you was dying, now sitting across from each other with a bowl between them that tasted like a reason to stay. The narrator does not call it love, because calling it love would be the easy, soft word for a thing that had been earned the hard way. And the easy word is not the true one here. Ami ate her own bowl last again that night, the way she had eaten it on the cookshack step those first days. But this time she ate it sitting down, in a kitchen someone had built for her, in a town that had come asking instead of writing her out. The small physical detail did all the work. A woman eating sitting down for the first time in a long time, and the narrator left it there. Hank's grief for Mary was not erased by any of it, and the vow was not finished just because the keg was shared. The town that had come asking was the same town that had come with rope a month before, and the narrator held both of those truths in the same hand and did not close the hand around either one. The cedar keg, lacquered dark, sat on the shelf of a kitchen it had never expected to see, and the living culture inside it was still hungry, and still tended, and still going. The keg breathed on the shelf, still hungry, still tended, in a town that came asking instead of riding her out. What stays is harder to know, whether a woman who carries a living thing can set it down, or a hard man who forgot how to want can learn to stay. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far it travels, and hit that like button if it moved you.